I want to thank you all for coming. It's been a terrific event. I hope you agree. I wanted to remind you all of UPCEA's Centennial Conference, which is coming up March 30 to April 1. If you miss it, don't worry, because it comes around every 100 years. Okay. If that seems like a long time, it is more frequent than the Halley Comet. So we hope to see you in Washington for that event. Also want to remind you of the Online Leadership Roundtable, which is June 17 to June 18 in Boston, hosted by 5 of the leading institutions in Boston. We're really excited about that. It is complimentary for a Chief Online Learning Officer at each member institution. So make sure you come. Hotels on you, travel's on you, but the registration is complimentary for members. I also want to thank one more time our partner ACE, who's been terrific to work with throughout this process. They've got awesome people who have been so instrumental in brainstorming the kinds of sessions that we know that senior leaders like you would find helpful. So thank you, ACE. With that, I would like to just introduce Ray Schroeder, who will in turn introduce Michelle Weise. Ray has a dual role. He is the founding director of UPCEA's Center for Online Leadership and Strategy. He also, because he doesn't sleep, maintains his position as Associate Vice Chancellor for Online Learning at University of Illinois Springfield, one of the top-ranked online providers according to U.S. News & World Report. Ray.
Thank you very much, Bob, and gosh, hasn't this been a great conference? Thank you all for coming. Well, as good as it has been, we have saved the best for last, and we are really delighted to have our closing speaker, Michelle Weise, who is a senior research fellow at the Clayton Christensen Institute, and she specializes in disruptive innovation, of course, as the Institute does in higher ed. She works to inform policymakers, community leaders, academic administrators such as we, and innovators such as we, on how the theories of disruption clarify our understanding of the changing academic terrain. She co-authored recently a book with Clayton Christensen about how online competency-based education will revolutionize the workforce and disrupt higher education. It's titled Higher, H-I-R-E, Higher Education, Mastery, Modularization, and Workforce Revolution. Michelle's commentaries and research have been featured in many publications, The Economist, most recently The Wall Street Journal. I think I stopped reading after 200-some comments in this last week. Harvard Business Review, Bloomberg Business Week, Boston Globe, etc., Chronicle. But prior to joining the Institute, Michelle served as the Vice President of Academic Affairs for Fidelis Education. She also held instructional positions. She was a professor at Skidmore College and an instructor at Stanford University. Michelle is a former Fulbright scholar and a graduate of Harvard and Stanford. So I invite you to welcome to our conference Michelle Weise.
Hello, everybody. I am a living proof of the inefficacy of the flu vaccine, and so I am recovering. Don't worry, I'm no longer contagious, but I do have a lingering cough, and so I apologize in advance that this is not going to be the most mellifluous presentation. Before I was asked to give this talk, I was told that many of you have been exposed to the theories of disruptive innovation, and so I'm not going to go into detail about some of those exact same stories that my colleague Michael Horn may have shared with you. But one of the things that I do want to make sure is that we're all on the same page in terms of really understanding the markers of disruptive innovation, because I'm always somewhat startled to see how frequently and how broadly the term is misused within this ecosystem. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time just clarifying some of the real sort of things that need to emerge in order for us to call something a disruptive innovation, and then move on to the kinds of models and things we need to be thinking about in terms of the future of higher education. So just briefly, here is a nice definition of a disruptive innovation, and that is, of course, Clayton Christensen up on the screen. And really, it is a process by which a product or service takes root initially in simple applications at the bottom of the market and then relentlessly moves up market, eventually displacing incumbent organizations. And just a few things that I want to point out. One way to just sort of visualize what exactly this means is to think about industry. And you can broadly describe the history of most industries with a set of concentric circles. And if you imagine in that centermost circle having customers who have the most amount of skill and wealth, and those larger the larger circles representing larger and larger populations of people, but those people having less wealth or less skill. If we think about most modern industries, they usually take root in that centermost circle because the first manifestations of a product or service are often quite complicated and expensive. And so the first users who can actually take advantage of those products are the ones who can afford it. And usually you have two trajectories that occur in that centermost circle. You have the performance of a product or service over time. And really what that includes is a company just trying to make better and better products for their most demanding and sophisticated customers. At the same time, there's always a second trajectory. So you have these sort of incremental improvements sometimes, or breakthrough dramatic improvements that companies are trying to engage in for their best customers. But at the same time, you also have a trajectory of the ability of customers to actually utilize that improvement and take advantage of those improvements. And there always comes a point at which the improvements outstrip the customer's ability to actually take advantage of those improvements. And so one way to visualize this is to just think about in the 1980s, you had that Intel 286 chip, which at that time was the world's fastest chip. But it could barely keep pace with people's fingertips as they did very simple tasks like word processing. Now, if you think about the laptops in front of you or your iPads, you only really utilize a bare fraction of what those machines have to offer. And really that represents that moment at which that blue outstrips the red. We are only able to utilize that small fraction of what is in our hands. We call these innovations sustaining innovations because this is what has historically helped companies succeed. By charging the highest prices to their most demanding customers, they achieve greater profitability. And almost always, the companies that really do sustaining innovations well are the incumbent organizations. No matter how complicated the technology is, they will figure out a way to get it done. But of course, there is another set of innovations that we call disruptive innovations. And these explain why it is so difficult for organizations to sustain success. And because these companies often tend to innovate faster than their customers' needs evolve, most end up making room for this set of countervailing innovations, which drive prices down. And ultimately, these two forces kind of in aggregate keep prices in line. And one thing I just want to reinforce again from that definition that we started off with is that this is a process. Disruption is not an event. I think people sometimes expect the immediate downfall of an incumbent organization, but that is not the case. These things take time. So if you think about what happened in the steel industry, really the integrated steel mills were disrupted fully by 1996, but that is over 30 years after the first disruptive entrant comes into the market and is making mini mill technology really truly viable at that time. That happens in the late 60s, and it's really not until 1996 when those mini mill companies are able to sort of move up market from rebar to angle iron, ultimately to structural and sheet steel, and basically eviscerating the steel industry. Right now, out of all the integrated steel mills that we used to have, only one still stands, and that is U.S. Steel. Meanwhile, many mills, their market capitalization dwarfs that of U.S. Steel. The same thing happened when Sony was able to disrupt RCA and Zenith. The first transistor technology doesn't emerge, it emerges in 1947, but it's really not until the late 60s when Sony is able to move up from the transistor radio to black and white televisions to tabletop radios, and then ultimately disrupt RCA and Zenith. Same thing happens with the car industry. In the 1960s, Toyota comes out with its very crummy little car called the Toyota Corona. Yes, the Corona, not the Corolla. But it's really not until the 1980s when the Detroit auto industry really feels the damage. Same thing in the personal computer market. It's for the first 10 years that personal computers are being commoditized. Most existing customers of mini computers don't see any value in the personal computers for the first 10 years that it exists on the market. These things take time, and there are often different waves. Just briefly, often when people think of a disruptive innovation, they only think about technology, and it's framed as some kind of technology problem, but that's not correct. This is really important to understand because when people bandy about the term disruption, they often miss the fact that in order for disruption to occur, you have to have the right technology, the right customers, and the right business model. And so here are just a few questions to consider as you think about whether something is really a disruptive innovation or not. Is this innovation actually targeting people who are non-consumers or who are overserved by existing products? Non-consumption is really important. So when you think about, if we think back to the example of personal computers, when the first Apple computer was being marketed, it was marketed toward children and hobbyists. It wasn't going after the same market of people who were utilizing mini computers. And so children, even though they were confronted with a not-so-great personal computer, they were delighted by what it had to offer because their alternative was really nothing at all. So that's what we mean by non-consumption. Is this innovation not as good as existing products as judged by historical measures of performance? This is really important because people tend to think about even something like online education and they think, oh, well, that is an inferior product to what it is that I deliver on a campus. But sometimes you actually need to understand that the disruptive innovation is often marked by the categorization of being just good enough. It only has to be just good enough to gain traction at the bottom of the market. Is the innovation simpler to use, more convenient, or more affordable? Again, you need to be catering toward those larger and larger populations of people. Is there a technological enabler that can carry the new value proposition up market? So it's not purely about technology, but you do have to have technology in order to scale that value proposition, that low-cost value proposition up market. I've heard people talk about disruptive innovations that do not involve technology that cannot exist. Is the technology paired with a business model innovation that allows it to be sustainable? So what we mean by this is you really need to have disruptive channels and a business model that enables that disruptive innovation to actually grow. When the personal computer, just to go back to that example, was first being was emerging on the horizon, the people at Digital Equipment Corporation, as well as the people at IBM, saw something happening with personal computers, but had very different responses to what they should do with this disruptive entrant. Digital Equipment, they tried to cram it into their existing model, and they found that the only way they could make the personal computer work for their existing business model is if they charged $50,000 per personal computer. And we all know that they started out more at the price of $2,000 per unit, so that just wasn't feasible. IBM, on the other hand, decided to separate the personal computer headquarters from their mainframe and mini computer headquarters in New York and Minnesota. They set up shop in Florida and allowed them to create their own business model to make this high unit volume, low overhead, low prices model work for themselves. And who emerged? IBM. The same thing also happens with channels. You have to have the right channels set up. In 1997, Intel and SAP tried to create a low-cost enterprise resource planning software. They called it Pandesic, and they were really excited because they thought it was going to disrupt the ERP space. But what they did was they had the same salespeople who were selling the more expensive ERP software also try to sell the Pandesic software. And so what do you think the salespeople did? They obviously went towards the more high-performing, more expensive products to sell. You have to separate your channels in order to make room for these kinds of innovations. And then finally, are existing providers motivated to ignore the new innovation and not threatened at the outset? We call this asymmetric motivation, which is that the incumbent organizations are asymmetrically motivated to pursue profits in that centermost circle, and they find what is going on in those outer circles financially unattractive. In general, higher education has really performed like an industry that has been immune to disruption, much like the hotel industry. The hotel industry, and we can argue now with the introduction of something like Airbnb whether this is still the case, but in general, if you think about something like a Four Seasons hotel, it is very difficult for a Motel 6 to move up market and displace a company like the Four Seasons, because in order to do that, you actually need to replicate the cost position of a Four Seasons. You actually have to build the rooms as nicely as them. You have to invest in more amazing concierge services. There is no way to take advantage of a technological enabler to help you move that Motel 6 value proposition up market and invade the space of the Four Seasons. In higher education, we've had the same thing occur up until about 1989. So I think there's been a lot of speculation about when is higher education going to be disrupted. Well, the truth is it actually did begin in 1989. And I know this is going to be scandalous, but places like the University of Phoenix and DeVry universities, when they first started launching their fully online private ventures, this is really when that just good enough technology takes hold. And again, people, when they hear me talk about the University of Phoenix, they immediately dig their heels in and they say, well, that has nothing to do with what it is that I do on my campus. They deliver a much more inferior product than what it is that I do on campus. But again, remember that it has to be just good enough in order to gain traction at the bottom end of the market. And in fact, what the University of Phoenix did so well is that they attacked a niche of non-consumers, which is folks who were unable to give up their jobs but knew that they needed to complete their degrees. And what University of Phoenix offered was that flexibility and convenience, and they were even willing to pay an extreme premium, up to $580 per credit hour for that so-called inferior experience. Now, of course, we have a second wave of innovation on price. You have places like American Public University System, Grand Canyon University, and then, of course, now the new sort of transformative wave coming on price and competency-based education. You have places like Western Governors University, College for America at Southern New Hampshire University, University of Now, University of Wisconsin, Northern Arizona University, now Purdue, and University of Michigan joining the ranks. Again, I just want to reiterate that what it is that these companies and organizations have been doing has been focusing on non-consumers. And we think about that in terms of a very different market of what we call non-traditional students. Of course, this This categorization of non-traditional students is actually now becoming much more of a misnomer, because approximately 70% of students would probably qualify under this categorization. These are people who are over the age of 25. They often have family commitments, work commitments, ties to the geographic region that often get in the way of their ability to complete a degree. And nonetheless, despite the fact that there is this sort of inhabiting of this space of the non-traditional market, a lot of traditional institutions are sticking to their guns and investing in sustaining innovations, really increasing their focus on inputs like, better facilities, increased technological advancements, adding more technology to the classroom. The difficulty with the incumbent organizations is that they see all of the developments going on in the horizon, but they are unable to do anything but to develop these sustaining innovations. And part of that has to do with the pull of the rankings race, or that arms race, to really be more and more like a Research One university. And part of that involves ramping up the consumption amenities on a campus. The other problem that occurs is it's very difficult for incumbent organizations to do anything but deliver on those sustaining innovations because of the business model of delivering higher education. And if you think about it, most businesses, and as much as universities dislike being likened to a business, they do have a value proposition. And what they try to do in order to deliver on that value proposition is put into place resources, processes, and then after several iterative cycles of change, they try to determine some kind of revenue formula that will make it possible to deliver on that value proposition. The problem with most business models is that once you actually get to the point of getting to a sustainable revenue formula or profit formula, it begins to work in reverse. And it begins to dictate what value proposition you are actually able to deliver. So things get very much locked. To complicate matters, on a typical campus, we actually usually deliver 3 very different and often conflicting value propositions. One is research, and that is what we call a solution shop model. We also try to deliver on the teaching model, which is more of a value-adding process activity. And then at the same time, universities run a multitude of facilitated networks. These are networks within which students work with each other, career staff and alumni to succeed and have fun. And so a typical university today is the equivalent of merging a McKinsey with a Jiffy Lube with a Facebook. And if you think about that business model where you get that locked business model, we are now 3 times as constrained because of these multiple value propositions that are offered. And another way to describe how complicated this gets is to think about just the simple example of the legislative process in the US. Even if someone, a congressman, were able to think of a very innovative solution to some kind of pressing problem in society, before it actually becomes enshrined in bill as law, that bill has to move through so many different constituencies and appease so many different people with power that that same innovative solution looks so different at the end than what it was originally conceived to be. And these are the same kinds of processes that are at work within any organization. Everything that goes into balancing that one value proposition takes any kind of new innovative proposal and shapes it, ultimately will shape it into a sustaining innovation. And this is why traditional institutions are at a disadvantage when it comes to the emergence of things like disruptive innovations. They are asymmetrically motivated to pursue those sustaining innovations. Unfortunately, standing still is not an option. We now have about 4,700 4-year degree granting institutions in the United States, and they are all relatively expensive and relatively undifferentiated from one another. And so there's going to be a need to define a competitive advantage in this market. Part of that is a realization that you just cannot do all things well. I think the idea that the buffet model of higher education is most likely over, that institutions cannot necessarily be all things to all people. And what this is going to involve at this particular inflection point, as we think about the soaring tuition costs, as we think about the retreat of states from investing in public education, a turn inward is the way that we're conceptualizing how to brace for this future. And the way we like to think about this is, what is the real job to be done in higher education? This concept from our theories of disruption is very simple. The premise is quite simple. Customers don't just buy products or services, they hire them to do a job in their lives. And so we can think about it in terms of, why do students hire higher education in their lives? Today, when most of our colleges are trying to be everything to everyone, we should probably think that the job we hire a small regional college to do is and should be different than what we hire, say, a Harvard or a state flagship to do. This simple concept highlights how traditional institutions have historically performed numerous jobs for so many different people, and therefore might be susceptible to the same kinds of disruptive forces that newspapers faced, as they were undone piece by piece by providers like Google, CNN.com, Monster.com, LinkedIn, Craigslist, and others. Broadly speaking, if we think about this idea that people don't want to buy a quarter-inch drill, they want a quarter-inch hole, we can imagine that the jobs to be done in higher education look something like, I hire higher education to launch my career, to transition between careers, to help me transition into adulthood, to help me gain a broader conceptual understanding of the world. But there is also a shifting value proposition of postsecondary education, and that comes from the now increasing major skills gap in the United States, which has created a new job to be done that centers on learning to do in the workforce. Academics have historically separated teaching and scholarship as a very distinct enterprise from vocational training, and utility was what graduate and professional schools were for, and college was the space and time to pursue passions and gain that global perspective. Unfortunately, however, in their turn away from specific workforce needs, colleges and universities have unwittingly left unattended this growing niche of what we call non-consumers of traditional education. So many of those folks, as I mentioned earlier, 70% of people who are attending college at the moment don't have that residential college experience that we tend to glorify. Most work, they commute, and these people are overserved by the amenities, the services, and the socialization that are all bundled together within that traditional brick-and-mortar institution. And many are also underprepared for the workforce and seeking lifelong learning pathways and also more career-oriented training. The thing that I want to point out today is that as we think about the jobs to be done, and as we think about this growing job that centers on learning to do in the workforce, higher education institutions are now going to be competing with organizations they have never heard of before. And these are all organizations that are really getting at the inadequacies of that system, where I showed you the immense complication of coordinating those three different value propositions in a university. These companies are drilling down into those specific inefficiencies and really offering a specific value proposition for students who are not finding what they need at traditional universities. So education technology companies, alternative learning providers, not just MOOCs, they're finding their disruptive footholds by targeting these non-consumers. And they're noting that students, even from well-regarded colleges, are struggling to make it in the workforce. And so they're trying to build solutions for this missing connection between learning to know and learning to do. And what they're doing is that they're integrating those skill sets into a curriculum in alternative learning pathways. And these are all unbundled from the excesses of campus-based programs. And they're brief and they're targeted. If we think about what's going on in coding boot camps, students are attending for 6 to 12 weeks. They're living with each other. They are connecting with each other and trying to solve problems, learning programming languages. And by the end of those 6 to 12 weeks, in which they have invested $6,000 to $10,000, sometimes $20,000, they emerge with a $100,000 salary, and they're recruited by places like Adobe and Google. These places have a 65 to 99% job attainment rate, which is higher than what law school graduates are able to do when they're seeking jobs post law school. And the role of the employer is really becoming more and more critical. You have places like Udacity building nano degrees in partnership with companies like Facebook and Google. The other company that is interesting to think about, and again, these are not necessarily disruptive innovations, but these are things that are doing something very interesting that are worth noting. The Minerva project is trying to deliver an elite sort of Ivy League experience for half the price of the tuition of a Harvard or a Stanford. And what is fascinating is that out of the 27 people who signed up for the Minerva project, over half of them already had spent 1 year at an elite institution in the United States. And they didn't find what it is that they were looking for and transferred into the Minerva project. That is something that I think is worth considering. Just to give just to sort of highlight some different models that exist in this space, I think a lot of you have probably been hearing about unbundling or disaggregating staffing models in higher education, and this is really something that has emerged from the for-profit industry, but is now being taken advantage of places, nonprofits, for-profits alike. And that is, if we think about the multiple roles of a professor has to curate content. They have to deliver that content. They need to mentor and advise their students. They need to assess and evaluate all of the students' work, not to mention also produce new research in order to move forward in their tenure promotion processes. What a lot of models are now thinking about doing is, instead of offering those 3 different value propositions, they're just focusing on one, and that is teaching. And what they're doing is they're subdividing the role of the professor and having a whole separate team devote itself entirely to designing the curriculum or the course itself. Then they have a whole set of other faculty who are just there to serve as student support services and coach and mentor a student along in the process of learning. You also have tutors who make cost-effective interventions, and they come in when they realize that based on a student's clicks on the platform, they're struggling with completing a certain competency or a certain learning objective. And they then make their phone call or they email them, and they try to tutor them along in that one particular moment. You also have a whole set of different folks whose job it is solely to evaluate the student's work. And then, of course, you have a subject matter expert who helps inform some of the tutors and also the instructional design team when creating these courses. These kinds of models may sound quite odd or radical at first, but there's a case to be made for big strategic moves like this, and it's likely that they will have to occur in what we call separate or autonomous units. In our research, we see over and over again that it is nearly impossible for established leaders to disrupt themselves. So you have because new products or services demand such different resources and processes to deliver on that new value proposition, and they may have such a very different looking revenue or profit formula, they need to be given the latitude and autonomy to exist on its own. IBM, as I mentioned before, did this by separating physically their personal computer headquarters from their mini computer and mainframe computer headquarters. HP did this when they set up a separate inkjet headquarter from their LaserJet printers. Charles Schwab did this when they set up their online brokerage separate from their telephone-based and office-based brokers. The Intel Celeron chip which was trying to inhabit that low end of the microprocessor market, was also set up and given its own autonomy. Same with Dayton Hudson when they created the low-cost retailer Target. These companies were able to succeed by setting up separate autonomous organizational units to foster disruptive growth. And as I wrote recently in an interview, in a blog for Competency Works, I see David back there from the University of Wisconsin, what happens sometimes when you don't have that full autonomy is that you get into what David calls a kind of sausage making. And I'm just going to read a quote from him. He says, "I'm now convinced that Clayton Christensen was right. You have to house it separately. No matter what the idea or the purity of the idea that is the impetus for a new idea or a new direction or a new program or a new project, because of the structure of the system, so many different people have the opportunity to augment it or change it that it ends up being something pretty different by the time, if it even happens, than what it started out to be." And so it's really important to build in what Southern New Hampshire University President Paul LeBlanc calls breathing room. I'd just like to spend a little bit of time talking about what it is that we're most excited about in the field of higher education. And that is a real scrutiny and breakdown of the credit hour system, where we feel like we've been measuring the wrong end of the student for far too long. In general, this is the way we have historically delivered education, which is sort of this factory model, moving batches of students along after a very high-stakes assessment. We then move them on to the next grade or the subject matter. All of 2013, people were sort of hounding us, asking us whether MOOCs were disruptive. And what we were trying to say to folks was that that MOOCs at that time were missing a lot of the markers of disruption, but what we saw as more important and flying under the radar was competency-based education, where students advance upon demonstrated mastery. They have these explicit, measurable, transferable learning objectives that empower students. And assessment is a very meaningful part of the process. It's a positive learning experience where you have this constant feedback loop of low-stakes assessments and exercises that set a student up for that final success of going through that summative assessment. And students receive differentiated support based on their individual learning needs, and that at the same time we're very cognizant and very specific about what student learning outcomes are. And they emphasize competencies that include the application of knowledge and the creation of knowledge along with the development of certain dispositions and skills. Last year, we came out with a small book called Higher Education, Mastery, Modularization, and the Workforce Revolution. And what we were trying to articulate is that none of these things, such as online technology, mastery-based or competency-based learning, and workforce training, none of these things were necessarily new phenomena, but the combination of all of these things together was something that we thought was really worth paying attention to. And that has to do with the fact that if you actually have online competency-based education that is aligned to workforce needs, something very interesting happens in terms of the learning process, where it breaks down learning not in terms of subject matter, but modularizes learning to the point where you can actually stack together different kinds of learning objectives and competencies for emergent disciplines. So again, if we think back to those non-consumers who are overserved by what perhaps traditional institutions tend to offer, here we actually have the ability to create low-cost, brief, targeted solutions that are also built in collaboration with employers that can really target some of those skills gaps in the workforce. And so what we do in this book is we highlight the different kinds of ways in which different institutions are merging mastery-based learning with this idea of modularization, and also going into a backwards design process in collaboration with employers. What's really fascinating about these partnerships is that institutions and companies are actually recruiting directly from their existing pipeline of employees. And so if you think of a place like Southern New Hampshire's College for America, it's not actually open access. It's only people within the 70+ partner companies that can actually access this kind of education. And the reason why, like if you ask AT&T why they invested millions of dollars into the Udacity Masters of Computer Science program, which is now offering a $6,600 online Masters of Computer Science. If you ask AT&T why they did this, it's because they realized that it's impossible for them to go out and hire 10,000 new engineers. What they need to do is they need to skill up their existing workforce. And so the backwards design process of working with employers and also recruiting directly from this channel of students is really worth taking note of. At the same time, for the first time, we can imagine a real scalable and high-quality version of what Benjamin Bloom thought was too expensive to deliver when he came up with his 2 sigma problem. He thought that if you were able to combine one-on-one learning with mastery-based learning, that you would be able to achieve this 2 sigma differentiation in learning. But the problem was it's just too expensive to deliver on that tutorial experience. Here, however, because all of those low-stakes assessments and formative assessments are taking place online, there are people on the back end of these dashboards analyzing what it is that the student is really struggling with. And so one tutor can actually attend to a whole lot more students because they're able to intervene at the right time and help them along in the learning process. And this to us is just really a fascinating development in higher education. I just wanted to end with this interesting quote from Stuart Butler, who works at the Brookings Institution. And he says, "Some American university leaders will try to navigate these fraught times with a few tweaks here, a few layoffs there, and perhaps extra PowerPoint classes for the faculty. They will fail. Some will make concessions using technology for add-on services while trying to build a moat around the traditional business model. They will also court failure. The ones who succeed truly will have learned the lessons of survivors in the consumer electronic, newspaper, and other industries facing the existential threat of disruptive innovation." And I know that sounds a little bit disturbing, but I just want to reiterate this idea of evolving towards openness, because change, excuse me, change is not going to occur in half steps. And part of this process is really going to involve identifying the jobs to be done, because those small tweaks are not going to work. All institutions of higher education, and no one school has this figured out, will have to think more critically about how they offer their learning, justify their costs, and consider whether or how to adapt their curricula to changing labor market needs. And the instinct, I think, for some institutions might be to give in to what we call threat rigidity, or to cease being flexible in the face of these ordeals of change. But the oncoming disruption can be viewed as an opportunity to remove themselves from the rat race of rankings and really center on the student. So in order to respond to these tectonic shifts, institutions will need to consider actively why students hire them for higher education. And it's really going to come down to, what is the job to be done for your students? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. And I think many of the themes that you've touched are ones that we have talked about in this conference, as we heard from, of course, David Scable, and heard from the president of the University of Phoenix. And I will say, even in one of my recent Monday briefings, many of you may have received about the disruption of a milkshake, and what we learned from your colleague, Clayton Christensen, about what are we being hired to do. Michelle has kindly said that she's available to answer some questions. I'm sure this may have stimulated some interest, so please come to the microphones, and we'll field those questions as you may have them. I think I see Gary making his way, so you can step up here.
Thank you, Michelle, for your talk. I wonder what you see as the future of the Carnegie unit, and if it's going to go away, what will supplant it?
If it actually does go away, I think it would be supplanted by competencies. I think what's important to understand about competency-based education, which I think it is unlike MOOCs in that it is not a passing fad. I think the focus on the inadequacy of understanding what a student actually knows and can do with their knowledge is really taking hold because of how we're not actually getting what we need from that signaling mechanism of the degree. Because we have more and more employers who are actually becoming much more vocal about their dissatisfaction of the quality of degree candidates, we're realizing that there's not enough built into the degree where the credit hour is able to explain what it is the student can do with that knowledge. The problem, of course, is that the credit hour is incredibly efficient in terms of serving as a foundational basis of organizing the structure of a university, so it's very difficult to let go of the credit hour. But as we've seen, now we have over 200 colleges and universities that are sort of jumping on to the competency-based bandwagon, and a small minority of those are moving online, so there is traction being made.
There's an element here that I'd like to explore a little further. I'm Al Powell of Colorado State University, and that is that the focus here seems to be on output and outcome in the job market, whereas faculty, and I think the traditional institution, is heavily invested in the process. So there's a lot of focus on the drill, you know, and what size of drill, and whether it's a good drill, and whether it's a qualified drill, and whether what the drill is doing is being done in the right way and being evaluated the right way. And it is assumed, and sometimes incorrectly, that the resulting whole will be appropriate. But if I were to characterize a lot of the faculty I work with, they're assuming the outcome, but they're really focused on the process. And I see an incompatibility in terms of how you exhort people and encourage people to move forward unless you can strike that balance.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And I think that speaks to the need for those autonomous units. If you actually are leading a university or a college that is really intent on making big changes, it's going to be very difficult to convince your existing faculty to make that dramatic mental shift into a totally different way of delivering education. And that is why some of these universities are developing a completely separate unit to just give them the latitude to build something that looks quite different from what it is that they're doing on campus. I've had numerous conversations with faculty members where they'll argue with me and they'll say, but I know exactly what it is that a student is thinking in my classroom, or I know that when I'm pitching materials, it is exactly the right level at which the students need, and it encompasses those stragglers and the ones who are more advanced in the classroom. And that's wonderful if you can believe that, but it's also not that it's going to be just inordinately difficult to take hundreds of faculty members and convince them that what it is that they're doing has some flaws. So the power of building that autonomous unit is that you can have people who are on board for that specific mission, who don't need to be convinced, who can deliver on that very new value proposition and incorporate different processes.
Let me step in and follow up on that just a little bit, because to the degree that you separate from the mothership of the university, continuing ed is in peril. I am not an advocate of, I'm an advocate of staying within the university system and being a part of the mainframe university process. So I understand that there needs to be a lot of finesse with how this is done, because to the degree that you split off, you also become not one of us and not part of what we do here. And at that point, your existence is tenuous. And it's not a great position to be in. Also, it automatically puts you in the position of being lesser than, especially the research-based part of the university. It's, you know, that's what universities hang their hat on, is what you're getting here is the product of the research and the process. So I see the point you're making, but I think it's something that has to be done with care, or the people in that unit are exposed to great danger.
Yeah, I mean, you really do have to have leadership involved to help make that separation work. And today, actually, if more of you are interested in this process of actually how to give something breathing room, on Competency Works, I published today or yesterday an interview with Paul LeBlanc, who talks about how he was able to separate 4 distinct units within the university, and what that involved in terms of faculty governance structures, and even just physical distance. Yes?
Hi, thank you. I'm from Penn State, and we have had a very large online component and are very much talking about competency-based education as well. So this has been great. One of the things that I'm interested in, though, we in the college that I'm in hold very near and dear to our heart that relationship between the student and the faculty member. Mm-hmm. And we really pride ourselves in being able to have students have that very close relationship even at a distance. And we hear from students at big institutions like ours a lot of complaints if they're working with a graduate student or someone they think is lesser than the faculty member. So the piece of the competency-based models that I've seen that actually I'm very curious about is why the tutor and the coaching model? Why not just more faculty whose sole responsibility is teaching? We're exploring that at our institution. I actually have a huge number of faculty who work in our college and have only that role. Even though we're a research institution, they are not research faculty, they are teaching faculty. So we're able to still have that one-on-one relationship directly with the faculty member, and the faculty member has the headroom to do that. So I wondered if you could just speak more about why, because I haven't had a chance to ask that question yet, why that lower level of coaching and tutors instead of just more faculty focused on teaching?
So the thing I think that's worth considering are the assumptions that are built into what we think about as a good teacher or a good faculty member. And I think because of the way accreditation works and the way we have set up academic faculty profiles, we tend to uphold, for instance, the PhD as signifying that this person knows how to teach. The problem, of course, is that just because you have a PhD doesn't mean that you're actually a very good teacher. And so I think just to give you an example, Udacity has been approached by over 500 different professors who want to teach on their platform, and they are dismissed. They are not allowed to teach because they are looking for a very specific kind of teaching that relates online and that can do something for the students in a very different arena. And so I think, again, if we think back to that original graph of disruptive innovation, as you move out on the z-axis, the performance metric changes. Again, that idea of being just good enough is something very different. So when we look at these different models where faculty members don't have a traditional credential, or maybe they don't have a PhD and they are teaching students online, we tend to get very wary and we start to think, oh, that can't be as good as the teaching that occurs on campus and in person. But there's nothing inherently better necessarily about that in-person student interaction than what someone who is just devoted to actually tutoring and helping the student along in that process. So I think there are some assumptions built in there. And then I think the other shift that is occurring is even in some of these competency-based programs, there are not even instructors at all. And a lot of that work is happening and is the onus of the student. And they are sort of learning how to fit. for their own content and understanding how to use content in order to achieve their learning objectives. And part of that involves learning from each other. And so that peer-to-peer mentoring is also really important, and I think get short shrift in these conversations. But it seems like you wanted to...
Well, I wanted to speak to your first part. I'm in complete agreement, and so maybe I wasn't clear. I'm saying let's look at as a total, across all institutions, let's look at what we are assuming. I agree, having a PhD does not make somebody a good teacher. What we're looking at our institution is changing those credential metrics so that we hire a lot of what we call practitioner faculty. They are usually our own esteemed alum who have gone on to business, industry, government, nonprofits. They're doing amazing things. They don't have that credential, but we know that they are experts in their field, and they've got the person, we pick people who have the personalities to really do well in that online environment, and we're using mechanisms within our institution to be able to hire them, to be the instructor, not to be the tutor or the coach, but to be, that's I guess my point is, let's set the bar for everybody at having that really excellent teacher and look at rethinking how we consider who qualifies.
Yeah, and I think the folks who are working in this space are really focused on that student support services part. They're really investing, they're finding that they have to invest a whole lot more money into the support services than even the instructional design team.
Michelle, thank you so much, and thank you all for attending. Let's thank Michelle. Certainly, this presentation foreshadows discussions yet to come, and I look forward to seeing you all in March as Bob reminds us for the 100th annual conference of meeting of UPCEA. So travel well, and thank you so much for joining us here in San Antonio.